Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 438. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I just got back from PortFest, spent a few days up there hanging out with some awesome libertarians, had a great time, met quite a few fans of the show. So it was awesome. Anybody who I met, I had a great time talking to everyone, and definitely a great experience. Hope to go back to PortFest again next year. Another upcoming event, I will be at Freedom Fest in July. This year it's in Memphis. Co-host of the show, Connor Freeman, and also from the Institute, Keith Knight and Scott Horton will be attending as well. So if you didn't make it out to PortFest, think about coming over to Freedom Fest, and look forward to meeting more listeners and more people who read my work. All right, with that, I think I'm ready to get into the news today. We have a lot to talk about. Of course, we had one fewer show last week, and I should mention that both myself and Connor Freeman gave a talk at the main stage at Freedom Fest, and we plan to publish those shows in the coming weeks as extra episodes to kind of make up for the episode that we missed. And also, we're probably going to miss another episode in a couple weeks for Freedom Fest, so we may look at that week to run our speeches. But anyways, let's get into the news today, starting off here with what has been described as a coup in Russia, and we will get into it and break it down. All right, so this was written by Will Porter for antiwar.com on June 24th, and it includes an update. So this is the head of the Wagner Group who turned on Russia, declared an armed insurrection, and had some of his forces at least marching into Russian territory, taking at least one military base, and then there were reports that his forces were marching on Moscow. So, Will writes, Russia's Wagner Group has called off its march on Moscow and agreed to stand down after launching a 2-day mutiny and seizing a military base in southern Russia. The Kremlin said it would drop the charges against the company's leader, his name is Prigozhin, who has been guaranteed safe passage to Belarus. Prigozhin shared a brief audio statement on social media Saturday confirming his decision to withdraw, saying the Wagner Group would return to its field camps and continue their previous operations in Ukraine according to plan. This is a statement from him. They wanted to disband PMC Wagner. On June 23rd, we went on a march of justice in a day. We advanced on Moscow just short of 200 kilometers from the city, and during this time we did not shed a single drop of blood of our fighters, he said. Earlier on Saturday, the Wagner chief announced his troops had captured the Southern Military District headquarters in Rostov, Russia, less than a day after accusing the Russian military of launching a military strike on a Wagner position and vowing to take his complaints directly to the Kremlin. He harshly criticized the leadership of the Russian Defense Ministry, demanding the minister's resignation along with his chief of staff of armed forces. So Will writes, and his article is probably a day old at this point, but at the same time, I think it's pretty much up to date on all the most important news. Will says, while the full extent of the mutiny remains unclear, unverified videos making the rounds online purport to show active clashes between Wagner and Russian regulars. One of the more substantial claims was a Reuters correspondent saying they witnessed a military helicopter firing on a mercenary column driving in an area of Russia between Moscow and Rostov, but noted that the fight faced little substantial resistance on the road. The outlet also cited a Russian source who said Wagner troops have taken military installations, though these reports cannot be claimed. So initially, after Prigozhin announced his insurrection, the Russian government came out and announced charges on him, called it an insurrection. Then Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko claimed to have successfully negotiated a deal, and then the Wagner chief confirmed that. So I'm not sure what's going on here. We could get into a lot of speculation, and I do want to address some of the more popular theories that I have seen on social media because, this is what people believe in. There are reasons to support some of the statements, and there are reasons to think that some of them probably are a little ridiculous. So, I guess, let's start with this is all elaborate psyops orchestrated by Vladimir Putin. I have seen this meme shared by quite a few people, and it draws a red line from southern Ukraine, the Donbass area, maybe Zaporizhia, and it traces that line through Russian territory into Belarus, and it's basically claiming that this is the flight of Prigozhin in the direction that he's gone, and this is an elaborate way for Russia to reposition its units from the north to the south to launch a serious attack on Kiev without being noticed. Now, I think there's a major problem with this, right? So, the idea that just because Prigozhin, the head of PMC Wagner, made it into Belarus doesn't mean that the entire PMC Wagner forces are in Belarus. And without those 25,000 troops, Prigozhin is just a guy. I mean, he may be able to rally and find some weapons. He probably has some money, some influence, and things like that. But he himself does not just show up in Belarus and suddenly have an army to march into Kiev. So that seems kind of absurd to me and very likely to be untrue. I do think that if you look at probably how this impacted Russia's citizens, the fact that, you had... Even if the West claims that this was a coup attempt and that Putin's rule was really threatened and that, the Russian people now see Putin as weakened, the fact that the president came out and announced charges on this guy and then afterwards said, oh, the charges are being dropped. I don't think this is a good look for the Kremlin. So I really, 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 really think we should all be very careful about putting out any kind of statements here saying that we believe this is some kind of elaborate Russian psyops. Anything could happen. I'm sure it could play out that way, but I really don't see it. And a lot of the people who I see advocating for this, and I don't really want to call anyone out in particular, I guess, but a lot of the people that I see advocating for this position are people who I'm very skeptical of because in the past they have always said, oh, this is an elaborate Russian psyop. Look, last fall they were saying, oh, Ukraine is only taking territory because the Russians want them to take that territory. And that certainly wasn't always the case. So I don't think that this is an elaborate Russian psyops. Is it a legitimate coup attempt? I'm not sure of that either. It doesn't seem like Prigozhin necessarily had any of the elements he would need in place to really have taken over the Russian government. I mean, one important discrepancy here is that the Wagner group has 25 to 30,000 men. It's unclear of what caliber of fighters those are. There's, in Western media, the PMC Wagner is presented as, oh, this is an entire military that's basically made out of murderers and thugs from the Russian prison. And I do think there's some evidence that this is the case, that he, has recruited out of the jails and, I'm not sure what level of offenders. Russia has some very strict laws, and so who knows? These may not be all rapists running around, taking up guns for PMC Wagner. They could be mostly drug offenders or something like that. So it's unclear to me exactly who these people are, but we've heard Prigozhin complain weeks and weeks in a row that they were really struggling to get the weapons that they needed, and so it would at least suggest to me that even if that army was, say, of better trained than the average Russian soldier, and again, if you listen to the tactics that the Western media says that PMC Wagner deployed in Bakhmut, the battle there, to say, they claim that they were sending unarmed men to the front lines to dig trenches. And look, I'm not sure how true that is. I don't want to just repeat the claims of the mainstream media. I'm just saying that from what we know of the PMC Wagner, it's not like these were 25,000 of the most absolutely elite fighters that would somehow be able to chew through a 1,000,000-man Russian army and make their way and carry out legitimate regime change against Putin in Ukraine. So those are a couple. I also want to look at the idea here that this was orchestrated by the West, and I do think this is possible. I think this is probably some of the better evidence, or maybe there's some better evidence to support this. So a couple of things that made me think that this may have been sponsored by the West. The timing is interesting. We'll get into more of this later on. But everybody who listens to this show, we've been covering it. The Ukrainian counteroffensive has not been successful, and maybe one of the few things that would lead Ukraine to being able to take some territory would be the PMC Wagner going, leaving their positions, maybe forcing the Russian Ministry of Defense to redeploy and move around some of their troops and things like that. So I do think it was possible that the U.S. knew about this. I do worry that no matter what happens, the U.S. is Russia, the Kremlin is going to feel that this was a Western-oriented coup plot. And I do believe I saw reports of this, and I'm pretty sure that this is correct. And one of the reasons that I feel like it's kind of easier to confirm is because Prigozhin's speech, which, was unique because he was declaring an insurrection, was apparently placed on Russian TV channels through a hack. And you do wonder if maybe the West was behind this. So Dave DeCamp has this really important article out. Report says U.S. intelligence knew Prigozhin was planning mutiny in Russia. Several U.S. media outlets are claiming that the U.S. intelligence agencies were aware that the Wagner leader was planning to take military action against Russia's defense establishment before a short-lived uprising on Friday. According to a report from the New York Times, U.S. intelligence officials briefed senior military and Biden administration officials on Wednesday about Prigozhin's plans. The report said the congressional leaders were briefed on the plot on Thursday, which was also reported by CNN. The Washington Post reported the U.S. spy agencies picked up on intelligence in mid-June about Prigozhin's planning and armed insurrections and quickly informed the White House and other agencies. An anonymous U.S. official told the Post that Prigozhin's exact plans weren't clear, but that there was enough signals they were able to tell that something was up. The Post report says that the U.S. was concerned about potential instability would mean for the control of Russia's massive nuclear arsenal, but the U.S. wasn't concerned enough to make the information public, where it seems kind of unlikely, given the situation, that the U.S. would pass this information along to Putin. But again, from the Western perspective, what's been said about Wagner is that, Prigozhin's one of the worst people, that the PMC Wagner group is made up of a bunch of rapists and murderers that are now running roughshod around Ukraine, and that, this is a part of the military force creating a meat grinder in Ukraine. So it doesn't seem like if Prigozhin would have been successful in this coup, assuming that means that he was going to obtain power or something like that, that would create a more liberal situation for Russia. Excuse me. I don't think that Prigozhin would have been a better leader or anything like that in Moscow, even from the Western perspective. So, back to Dave's article here. The Times report said that U.S. officials felt that if they said anything, Mr. and Putin could accuse them of orchestrating a coup, and they clearly had little interest in helping Mr. Putin avoid a major embarrassing fracturing of his support. None of the reports said how U.S. intelligence obtained the information about Prigozhin's plans. Prigozhin had been publicly feuding with the Russian military leadership for months after accusing Moscow of not providing his soldiers with enough support for the brutal Battle of The feud escalated on June 10th when Russia's military brass said that volunteer fighters must sign contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry. Prigozhin said Wagner refused the order, which he saw by the Defense Ministry as an attempt to control the mercenary force. After launching the mutiny on Friday, Prigozhin's captured a military base in southern Russia and were headed towards Moscow. They turned around Saturday and returned to their base camps after Belarusian President Lukashenko brokered a deal between Prigozhin and the Kremlin. So, next up here is very important. Blinken on Russia crisis. We haven't seen the last act. And so this would really suggest that the U.S. may have had a hand in this after all. Secretary of State Antony Blinken suggested on Sunday that the U.S. was expecting more unrest in Russia following Wagner chief Prigozhin's two-day uprising. Blinken told CBS News on Sunday, "I think we're in the midst of a moving picture. We haven't seen the last act. We're watching it very closely and carefully." When asked if the U.S. was in touch with Russia about the crisis, Blinken said he instructed a team to engage with Russia to ensure they understood their responsibility in terms of protecting their own personnel. There is no sign that Blinken has attempted to speak with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov about the incident. Blinken says Prigozhin's dissent showed real cracks in Russia, and this is a statement. "It was a direct challenge to Putin's authority, so this raises profound questions. It shows real cracks. We can't speculate or know exactly where that's going to go. We know that Putin has a lot more to answer for in the weeks and months ahead." And I should say, I want to add this here, actually. I think it's a good point. Another little bit of evidence, I think, that the U.S. might have had some hand in this is how quickly the establishment was ready to pounce on this. Immediately, there's articles running in the Atlantic, basically saying that this is a civil war, that Putin's power is being threatened, and, praising this move. Suddenly the Wagner group goes from a bunch of rapists and murderers to freedom fighters looking to liberate Russia from Putin's control. And how quickly this narrative was rolled out is very concerning. Dave also notes that French President Macron made similar comments on Sunday, saying the mutiny shows divisions that exist within the Russian camp and the fragility of both its military and auxiliary forces. Macron said the crisis justifies Western support for Kiev. This is a quote, "All this should make us very vigilant and fully justifies the support that we are giving to Ukraine in their resistance." I'm not sure why that would be the case. And so let's start, I think, talking about the battlefield now. There's a couple stories I want to get to from before what the Wagner group did, but then I think it'll kind of all bring together, and we'll talk a little bit about what maybe the impacts of this are on the battlefield. So last week we have Ukraine strikes damaged bridge connecting Crimea to Kherson. This Russian officials said on Thursday that a bridge in northern Crimea that connects to Russia-controlled areas of Ukraine's Kherson Oblast was damaged by a Ukrainian missile strike. No casualties were reported in the strike, and the Russian installed acting general of the region said the damage to the bridge should be repaired within a few days. He also said the damage will inconvenience the local civilians but would not impact Russia's war effort. He also suspected that the Ukrainians used British-provided Storm Shadow missiles in the strikes, although Russia's investigative committee later said the missile fragments with French markings were found. And so this is interesting, given the timing of this strike. You do wonder if maybe the West informed Ukraine that they thought the coup was going to happen, and so with Ukraine's counteroffensive stalled off at the time, maybe they thought that the play here was actually, to start carrying out attacks last week and getting ready. So we also have this from last week. Russia says Ukraine planning strikes in Crimea with HIMARS and Storm Shadows. This is a Russian defense minister. He said last week, 1 week ago today, I believe, that the Russian military has information that shows Ukraine's planning to attack Crimea with U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems and British-provided Storm Shadow cruise missiles. And again, interesting given the timing, because a lot of the Western analysts believe that with the Prigozhin insurrection, there would be an opportunity for a major offensive that could even retake Crimea. So this is also, I think, very important. Biden says threat of Putin using tactical missiles and tactical nuclear weapons is real. And this is important, again, because I believe by this point, Biden probably would have been aware of the potential insurrection. So President Biden warned last week that the Russian President Putin is the threat of Putin using tactical nuclear weapons is real. The president made the comments to donors during a trip to California. This is a quote from Biden. "When I was out here about 2 years ago saying I was worried about the Colorado River was drying up, everybody looked at me like I was crazy. They looked at me like when I say I worry about Putin using tactical nuclear weapons. It's real." Biden has previously recognized that U.S. policy of the U.S. and NATO backing Ukraine against Russia risks nuclear war. In October of last year, he said the chances of a nuclear Armageddon were higher than any point in history since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. But since warning a nuclear Armageddon, Biden has done nothing to ease tensions with Russia and has escalated U.S. involvement in the war, including by giving a green light for European countries to send U.S.-made F-16s to Kiev. And this is, I always find this interesting because I think it's some of the better evidence that Biden may not be competent enough to quite be president, because you basically have his cabinet who seem to believe that unless Russia uses a nuclear weapon, then the U.S. isn't crossing a Russian red line. And so they keep pushing Russia and pushing Russia and pushing Russia and escalating this war further and further and further. And every time they do, they say, well, Russia didn't do anything about it, so I guess it's fair game. They're not going to do anything. And every once in a while, you'll have the president muddle, "I'm really worried about nuclear war." And so if Biden is so worried about nuclear war, why isn't he telling his cabinet, aren't our officials saying that, yeah, we are concerned about possibly crossing a Russian red line? That, if anything, they're saying the opposite. So this is from last week. Zelensky says Ukraine's counteroffensive slower than desired. This is a quote from Zelensky. "Some people believe this is a Hollywood movie and expect results now. It's not. What's at stake is people's lives. So far, Ukraine has claimed it captured 8 small villages in the southern Zaporizhia Oblast and in the eastern Donetsk Oblast since the counteroffensive began this month. Minimal gains have come at a high cost." Zelensky says his forces were having difficulty because Russia had mined a lot of areas. This is a quote from him. "Whatever some might want, including attempts to pressure, with all due respect, we will advance on the battlefield in the way we deem best." Leading up to the counteroffensive, Discord leaks and media reports revealed the U.S. did not expect Ukraine to regain significant territory, but the Biden administration pushed for the assault anyways and rejected the idea of a ceasefire or peace talks. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, has acknowledged the difficulties for Ukraine are real. "This is very difficult right now. It's a violent fight, and we will likely take a considerable amount of time and high cost," he said last week. I guess this will be about 2 weeks ago. Milley made that quote. Despite the situation, Zelensky said that victories on the battlefield are necessary and vowed that Ukrainian soldiers will continue fighting. So, more Ukrainian death, definitely. And now we have Western officials say that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is failing. Western officials told CNN that Ukraine's bloody counteroffensive is not meeting expectations on any front, as Ukrainian forces are struggling to break through Russian defenses. The report said that according to Western assessments, Russia's lines of defense have been well fortified and Russia forces have been able to bog down the Ukrainian vehicles with missile strikes and minefields. So this is the situation in Ukraine as of last week. I do expect that the map will probably look a little bit different, not significantly, in the coming days. I'm not 100% sure what's happening with the PMC Wagner forces. It may be that they're going to eventually join the Russian army, and this will cause no significant difficulties among the Russian defensive positions. However, I'm not sure that's the case, and I do not worry, I guess, but I do think that there's a possibility that this could lead to Russia losing some territory to the Ukrainian forces in the weeks to come. Now, I'm not saying that those positions will be forever taken by Ukraine, that, they're not going to launch some huge, massive success and take, the stretch of land across the Sea of Azov or something like that. But especially if the U.S. did pass intelligence to the Ukrainians saying that the Wagner forces are about to turn around and march, into Russia because of some dispute they have with Moscow. If Ukraine wasn't then able to figure out where the Wagner forces are, build up some assets in that region, and then try to carry out an attack, and maybe they would have some more success in those areas. And it's also going to probably be impacted by, what does Russia want to do with the Wagner forces now? Maybe Putin feels he can't trust those forces no matter what at this point, and the plan is to put them on the front line and send them into charge. And if they take some territory, that's fantastic. But if they end up dead, then a problem eliminated from the perspective of the Kremlin. I do not think that Prigozhin has a lot of time left. Maybe he flees to another country after he leaves Belarus or something like that. But just given the fact of what he did, I would be very surprised if Prigozhin lives for a significant amount of time after, and goes back to just kind of being the head of the Wagner group after all this. It seems to me that Putin would probably seek to eliminate this threat. Now, I guess one more thing I should mention here is in the past, we've talked about this show on the bit, these statements by Prigozhin, because he's constantly complaining about the actions of the Russian Defense Ministry, about how his forces aren't getting enough support and things like that. And I had long wondered if these were essentially a Russian psyops, and it doesn't appear that, at least certainly in this case, that wasn't the case. And this does give some insight into the past comments made by Prigozhin, especially the ones over the past few months. And they seem to give them more legitimacy and make it less likely that was just some kind of psyops. All right, this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute last week. Kiev elevating the states with cross-border attacks using neo-Nazis. A neo-Nazi aligned militant leader leading cross-border attacks into Russia using American-made military equipment told the Washington Post that his forces were escalating tensions with Moscow. An allied militia is preparing a new constitution for Russia after it helps to overthrow the government of Vladimir Putin. While Kiev denies public support for the militia, behind the scenes, Ukrainian officials are seeking to expand the operations. The Russian Volunteer Corps, RVC, led by Denis Kapustin, he has another name too, Denis Netstita or something similar to that. He also goes by, I think, like White Bear or White Eagle or something like that. In an interview published on YouTube, is one of the primary facts. So this guy is leading a lot of the raids that are going into Russia. There's also a Russian Legion also fighting on behalf of Kiev that are carrying out these operations. In an interview published on YouTube, he described the group's operations as full-scale attacks on the territory of the Russian Federation while it is under the occupation of the Kremlin regime. The stakes are getting higher and we are elevating them. The Post noted that members of the RVC have extremist ideals, including its leader. He is a former Moscow fight promoter with a history of violent extremism. In 2019, he was banned from Western Europe for rightist sports hooligan activities, according to the outlet. Kapustin described members of his group as ideological conservatives, traditionalists, and probably also socialists. So That sounds an awful like National Socialist to me. In a photo published by the Post, he is seen seated next to a fighter wearing a black sun symbol, a common neo-Nazi mark. The other paramilitary unit launching attacks in Russia is the Freedom Russia Legion, FRL, or also known as the Legion, and the leader of that group is a former member of the Russian State Duma. While the Post describes the FRL as more moderate and centrist than the RVC, one of its members acknowledged he was part of a radical rightist opposition group before joining the Legion. And so this is just Western propaganda that this group seems any better at all than the straight up neo-Nazi RVC. Most of the militia members are Russian nationals who have aligned with Kiev in the war, and many now live in Ukraine permanently. The Kremlin has labeled both the RVC and the FRL as terrorist organizations, threatening stiff prison sentences for Russians who join. The two groups work together, and they say they have no time to debate politics. We are both here to defeat Putin. The leader of the Legion noted that they share a common goal of forming a new Russian government from the, quote, grassroots, and said he was working to draw up a new constitution. And interesting, too, here, right, that we have this guy who seemingly would have no reason to believe that just because you're carrying out attacks about 2 kilometers into Russia, that you will one day overthrow the Russian government. And now he's working on a constitution mid-June, about the same time the U.S. apparently found out that they thought there was going to be an insurrection in Russia. It makes you wonder if this guy maybe had some information from the U.S. or Kiev about that potential operation. The FRL leader went on to voice hopes that the cross-border attacks would help win over the Russian people. We want to win hearts and minds, but for now that is irrelevant. It will only become important the day we enter Moscow. Another fighter from the Legion echoed the leader's statement, saying that we are liberators and we want to free Russia. As for Putin, he said, we have time to cut off the head of the tyrant. While the fighters insisted that the FRL was not made up of bandits and terrorists, the Post said that the VRC intends to intimidate Russia's citizens with the cross-border raids. The militia's aim is to give Russian citizens a taste of the death and destruction that President Vladimir Putin has wrought on Ukraine, and to show that Putin is failing to keep the Russian motherland safe, the outlet reported. Kiev has thought to keep its distance from the paramilitaries, at least publicly, even though the Legion claims to be working in full cooperation and with and under the leadership of the Ukrainian command. Its members report high-level contacts in the Ukrainian military, and Kiev pays the fighters' salaries. Kapustin, for his part, says the VRC has no formal ties with Ukraine's armed forces. A former senior Ukrainian intelligence official told the Post that Kiev's denials were only public, claiming that officials hope to actually expand support for the militias. Some of Ukraine's Western backers may view such groups as problematic, giving their fighters open neo-Nazi views, as well as the risk they could escalate the conflict in Ukraine with a direct war with Moscow. Last month, the Financial Times reported that the VRC used American military equipment to attack Russian targets in Russia. The Kremlin also shared photos purporting to show the wreckage of several U.S.-supplied armored vehicles destroyed during the cross-border attacks, though Washington dismissed the images as fuzzy pictures on social media. When additional photos appeared in subsequent news coverage, the State Department later said it was looking into those reports, but have offered no further details since. So, again, this is another story that may not seem... it seems important no matter what, I guess, especially given some of Lukashenko's recent comments. But given the actions by Prigozhin, this is, I think, maybe even more interesting. So, a group of Belarusian exiles are training in Poland to prepare the day they can return to Belarus and take on the government of President Alexander Lukashenko, the Times reported on Sunday. And this is the Times of London, I believe. The Times spoke with Belarusians who were training in a field behind a business park in Poland. The training was organized by BIPOL, a group of former officers of the Belarusian security service that were formed after the 2020 presidential elections in Belarus and the protests that followed. And so that was at least seen by Russia, and I'm pretty sure was actually a Western regime change attempt against the government of Lukashenko. The election saw Lukashenko win another term, but the results were rejected by the opposition leader and her supporters, who say the result was rigged. The U.S. and the EU also protest the results and increased sanctions on Belarus in response, pushing Lukashenko closer to Russia. After the Belarusian opposition fled the country and is mostly based in Lithuania at this point, the exiled opposition has taken credit for attacks inside of Belarus since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, including a blast that hit a Russian spy base. Although Discord leaks show the U.S. believes the rogue agents of the Ukrainian SBU are responsible. The training session for expired Belarusians is the first of its kind, but the leader of BIPOL said other groups had been training in Poland for months, with the recruits numbering in the hundreds. And again, so they're working on this, and with everything that happened in Russia, you do have to wonder. And look, even if it's not true, even if this is complete speculation, I do think that you have to look at the mindset of Putin and Lukashenko, and they may see this all as one giant elaborate tie to try to overthrow both governments or something like that. All right, next story I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. We're changing gears here a little bit, talking about some politics going on inside of Ukraine. Zelensky ratchets up culture war with ban on Russian butts. Ukrainian President Zelensky signed a bill last week banning the import of books produced in Russia or printed in the Russian language. The new law is Kiev's latest escalation in an extensive effort to eliminate the Russian culture in Ukraine. Since taking office, Zelensky has led a campaign of de-Russification within Ukraine. Last year, Kiev's legislature passed a bill that would heavily restrict books manufactured in Russia or printed in the Russian language. Zelensky announced he signed the bill on Thursday, saying, "I believe the law is right." Kiev's culture minister praised Zelensky for approving the ban. He said, "The adoption of the draft law will protect the Ukrainian book publishing and distribution center from the destructive influences of the, quote, Russian world." The bill signed into law last week will allow the ban all imports of books from Russia and Belarus. Additionally, the state will require a permit to import a Russian book from any third country. Zelensky's office said the law would strengthen the protection of Ukrainian culture and information space from anti-Ukrainian Russian propaganda. After Russia invaded Ukraine last year, Zelensky enacted a series of escalating steps with the goal of erasing from Ukraine and any and all of the Russian culture. Kiev was to destroy all Russian monuments, rename public spaces that are in the Russian language, and erase Russian historical figures, and target a branch of the Christian Orthodox Church Kiev believes is too closely tied with Moscow. The culture minister has long been an advocate of the culture war in Ukraine. In a 2015 interview, he supported the ban on TV series and movies that are produced in Russia or glorify the Russian people. One of his goals at the time was to replace Russian content on Ukrainian televisions with Western programming. While Kiev presents Moscow as the target of the culture war, the substantial minority of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers living in Ukraine are subjected to the laws. Zelensky has used the pretext of de-Russification process to consolidate control over Ukraine's politics and media. He's banned his political opposition, and he has also taken control over and nationalized the Ukrainian media. So this is, one of the great stories of the war in Ukraine. I don't mean great as in good. I mean great as in probably most memorable, something that's going to get a lot of shares and really break into the mainstream. This is something I keep hearing people that I was talking to this past weekend at PortFest talk about $6.2 billion just magically appearing or disappearing from the Pentagon's book. So this is from last week. The Pentagon on Tuesday claimed that an accounting error has freed up $6.2 billion to spend on military aid for Ukraine. The Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh told reporters that weapons sent to Ukraine from U.S. military stockpiles using the Presidential Drawdown Authority were overvalued by using the cost to replace the arms rather than the depreciated value. So, I'm not sure this is right, by the way, because the way the PDA works and the way that Congress has funded this is they've said that the U.S. can ship Ukraine X billions of dollars of weapons from our own stockpiles, and then we're giving the White House money to replace those weapons. And so I guess initially the way the White House was counting this, I would think would be the actual correct way to do it was, let's say you send a Abrams tank to Ukraine. That tank's 10 years old. So the new tank has new technology and equipment and all that and everything else, right? So the new tank, let's say, costs $1 billion to replace, but the tank that they sent has a value of, let's say, $650 million. I'm just making up numbers here. I have no idea off the top of my head what the price of an Abrams tank is, so I could be way off. But let's say 35% less is the value. It's a 10-year-old tank. Doesn't have the upgraded sensors and things like that in it. So it just seems like very, very tricky accounting to now say, oh, we actually want to count it the other way. And who knows, in 3 more months, they could actually scratch their heads and say, well, we were kind of estimating as to the value of that equipment. And it turns out it really wasn't worth as much as we thought it was. Some of it was broken. Some of it needed replacement parts, all these things. And so that tank that we said was worth $650 million, well, maybe it was only worth $300 million. And then they buy themselves another $5-6 billion worth of aid to send to Ukraine. I think one maybe positive note in all this is that the fact that the Pentagon is doing this. So I think this probably predictably creates some bad press for the United States, right? The fact that the U.S. is trying to maintain and tell all of its people that every single weapon that we are sending to Ukraine is being tracked and being used against the Russians, and we absolutely know for sure, no problems at all. We're 100% competent in doing this correctly. And then at the same time to come out and be like, yeah, but a significant number of the weapons we sent, we didn't value them correctly. That seems to be a real flaw. And I think a lot of people are picking up on this. And so I do wonder if that maybe the White House is a little bit concerned at this point that if they do have to pass another bill with another massive round of military aid for Ukraine, I don't want to say that won't get passed, because I do think it will. However, maybe they're worried that bill will include the establishment of some kind of special investigator general for tracking these weapons, some kind of, real tracking mechanism for the aid going to Ukraine, and they don't want that. So at this point, they're doing everything possible to push off the need to ask Congress for more money until a time when maybe they feel they have a better political propaganda type, standing in the U.S. If Ukraine retains some territory, or they could significantly scare the American people that Russia is going to do something awful, then, or something like the coup attempt as well, the alleged coup attempt as well, is something that maybe could be used to propagandize the American people to have more blind support for arming Ukraine. Now, again, I don't think there's actually enough pressure in Congress to prevent another massive aid package from going through. It's just a matter if those who are opposed to it, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, etc., have enough leverage to actually be able to get some kind of inspector office set up for this aid. And part of the reason I believe that's the case is we have this story here from Jade Camp. House panel passes bill calling on Biden to send Ukraine long-range missiles. The House Foreign Affairs Committee on Wednesday passed a resolution to pressure President Biden to escalate U.S. involvement in Ukraine, by supplying Kiev with longer range missiles. And so these are the ATACMS missiles. They have a range of about 200 miles, about 4 times longer than the HIMARS missiles that the U.S. has currently been providing Ukraine, and about double the range of the ground launched small diameter bombs that the U.S. has been sending Ukraine for a shorter period of time. Have, I think, a pretty similar range to the Storm Shadow cruise missiles that the UK is now providing Kiev. And so my guess is that in Washington, they probably feel that Ukraine's sending the Storm Shadow missiles, and they say, oh, we sent not Ukraine, the UK sent Ukraine the Storm Shadow missiles, and since they got away with that, then that means that we could get away with sending Russia the ATACMS missiles. Not sure that that's going to go over the same way in Russia as they think, but I do think this shows that in general, Congress wants Biden to escalate this war more than he wants to. Again, the only question is if the dissenters in Congress would be able to get some kind of IG office set up here. We are now hearing that Lockheed Martin is standing by, imagine that, to help Ukraine with F-16s. The U.S. weapons maker Lockheed Martin says it's standing by to help Ukraine fly and maintain F-16 fighter jets once NATO countries finalize their plans to provide Kiev with the aircraft. And you might ask, why would Lockheed Martin do this? Well, my strong suspicion here is that Lockheed Martin says as many F-16s that go to Ukraine and get blown out of the skies means the more probably F-35s that NATO countries are going to buy. And so every time that Poland or Sweden or one of these countries sends Ukraine an F-16, well, that's just another F-35 that they need in their own arsenal. And the board of Lockheed Martin is just salivating over the billions of dollars they're going to make at the expense of the rest of us. So we do have this story here. Ukraine says F-16 training for Ukrainian pilots will start in July. It's from the Ukrainian defense minister. So maybe not. I guess I'm still a little skeptical. I guess part of this will probably depend on, and I wouldn't even be surprised if NATO maybe waited for after the summit in July that's going to take place in Lithuania before they go ahead and announce their plan. So it could be a little later than this. At the same time, there could already be covert training programs going on. I do believe the U.S. has trained at least a couple Ukrainian pilots on these systems. So I really don't know what the time frame is on getting these weapons, these planes into Ukraine. I still think it's probably a pretty long way out. New York Times, Western countries have sent broken weapons to Ukraine. This is something that Ukraine has been complaining about for a while, that the U.S. weapons, particularly going to Ukraine, are not at sometimes functioning status, like the tires on the Humvees aren't up, the guns won't fire, things like that. Hard to say how significant these repairs are. I do really wonder, after we read the accounting error story, if one day that, we're going to go back and actually evaluate the value of all this equipment based on its condition, and these Humvees were all broken, so actually their value was significantly less than the U.S. initially claimed. The Pentagon is trying to convince Congress to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. This is something that might happen. We've been talking about this for a while. I think there's a large feeling in Congress and just among the Americans in general that, we got all these cluster munitions laying around, so why not send them to Ukraine so at least they don't have to go bad. All right. A couple more stories here before we wrap up. We have U.S. bombers landing in Sweden for the first time as Sweden prepares to enter the NATO alliance. It's unclear if Sweden is going to be a former member of NATO, or if there's going to be maybe some official announcement on the breakthrough. Turkey will finally relent and allow Sweden to join NATO coming up at the summit, Vilnius summit that's in Lithuania in July for NATO. But Sweden's a de facto member anyways. It's, really an all but writing at this point. We have another 1.3 billion in aid going to Ukraine. This is reconstruction aid. So look, I know there's a lot of money that from the American perspective, from my perspective, there's a lot of money going to Ukraine. All these billions of dollars is huge. At the same time, this is minuscule to the amount of damage that has been done to Ukraine. And of course, the West is largely responsible for that by fueling the proxy war in the country. Jade Sullivan, Victoria Newland, to attend Ukraine organized meeting in Denmark. National Security Advisor Jade Sullivan will travel to Denmark this weekend for a meeting organized by Ukraine that is expected to be attended by officials from several countries that have remained neutral on the war, including India, China, South Africa, and Brazil. Ukraine requested the meeting with non-aligned countries, and Sullivan's expected to push them towards increasing support for Kiev. The meeting hasn't been announced and was first reported by the Financial Times on Wednesday. Victoria Newland, the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, will also attend the meeting along with a senior European Union official. The guest list hasn't been finalized and could change before the meeting. The officials at the meeting are expected to discuss peace proposals, and I think this is important because the countries attending this meeting are the countries that have actually suggested that we need peace, we need to work out some kind of agreement, and we're going to have the probably most hawkish American Victoria Newland in the room to try to convince them otherwise. By the way, I have heard I believe it's confirmed that Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, will be retiring sometime soon. I've heard reports that Victoria Newland is likely to replace her. This is extremely bad news. All right, last up here, Ukraine's still pushing for NATO membership at the Vilnius summit. I don't think this is going to happen. I really, really don't think this is going to happen. But Ukraine not giving up is somewhat interesting. My guess is this week, next week, but particularly the week the week after the 4th of July. I think that's going to be like the 5th through the 11th or so, is going to be just a flood of stories. Ukraine is going to be doing everything they can. Hots are going to be doing everything they can to push NATO to go ahead and give this guarantee. I don't think it will happen at this summit in July. However, as hard as they are pushing, they must think they have something. They must think they're close. And so I do really worry that we could be talking about Ukraine getting this path to NATO membership at a summit late 2023, maybe early 2024. All right, everybody. That was a lot to get through today. I appreciate you all so much for listening through it and, being understanding as I'm doing some traveling, and we didn't have 3 shows last week as we usually do. But again, hopefully we'll be able to make that up by putting out mine and Connor's speeches on the channel. I haven't heard Connor's speech yet, but from everybody I talked to at PortFest who was able to attend, it was absolutely phenomenal. So I'm really looking forward to bringing that to y'all. He was talking about China. I gave one on Russiagate. I think I did a pretty good job. I think you all will enjoy it as an episode of the show. So I look forward to putting that out as well. Anyways, thank you so much for tuning into the show. Please share the show, and I will see you guys next time.